case you haven't heard, Wicked is kind of a big deal. It's been received phenomenally. It's doing great at the box office, but I did look at some of that box office data and found something kind of interesting. 74% of its box office was from domestic or US audiences, and 25% international. And if we look at other big movie musicals, we'll see that it's kind of the opposite of that. So with Mamma Mia, it was flip-flopped. Only 23% was domestic, and 76% was international. Same thing with Les Mis, 33% domestic, 66% international. And even with last year's Wonka, which wasn't an adaptation of a Broadway musical, but was still a musical, 34% domestic, 65% international. I even read in one article that Wicked was perceived to be domestically driven at the box office. Something to note really quick before I go on is that there's a handful of markets that Wicked is only just barely starting to release in internationally. I don't think the box office in any of those markets will fully reverse this trend. So I wonder, does Wicked being more of a hit in the US than international audiences have anything to do with the Wizard of Oz's long history as being the American fairy tale? What do I mean by that? The book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is part of the Library of Congress's permanent collection and is said to be the first American fairy tale to enjoy immediate success. If we take a quick look at some other modern fairy tales, we can see they're pretty heavily informed from the culture they come from. Just a few quick examples from over the pond. Tolkien was writing The Lord of the Rings. He said that he was creating a mythology for England. And C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia are definitely more of a Christian allegory, but they're heavily informed by what was going on in his country at the time. At the beginning of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the kids are sent away from London to live in the countryside because the city is being attacked, and that's something that was actually happening in World War II in England. And L. Frank Baum was basing his story in a world he knew when he wrote a fairy tale about a girl from the Midwest living on a farm who got transported to a magical land through a Kansas tornado. In the 124 years since the original story was published, we've revisited it many times in many different formats. But even if we just look at some of the versions that would be most well known to us today, we still see 5 distinct iterations of the story that has been called America's greatest and best loved homegrown fairy tale. So what about the story resonates so deeply with American audiences? The original story has been dissected and analyzed from every which way. There's even a group of people that are pretty adamant that it's an allegory for a political movement called the Populist Movement in the 1890s. But in the introduction to the book, the author himself wrote that he was basically just trying to give kids an entertaining story. The fairy tales he was familiar with always had a grim ending that was meant to teach kids a hard moral lesson. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written solely to please children of today. It aspires to being a modernized fairy tale in which wonderment and joy are retained and the heartaches and nightmares left out. Still, we can't help but notice a theme, and I think it's quite a bit different than the one that was conveyed in the famous movie that came almost 40 years later. For instance, in the book, the witches are not really primary protagonists or antagonists. They're set pieces in an ongoing quest meant to show Dorothy's self-reliance, basically telling kids that they have the ability to take care of themselves. Now we jump to the most famous adaptation, the 1939 movie, The Wizard of Oz, which is really what cemented the story as an icon. Even if you've never sat down and watched this movie, you've absorbed its cultural impact through different means, whether it's the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow or the phrase pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And obviously the design for the Wicked Witch of the West is now the standard look for a witch. But the movie reoriented the themes of the book. Originally, Dorothy was pretty much immediately swept up by the tornado into that fantasy land, but here in the movie, we get this big backstory about Dorothy wanting to leave home, aspiring to some big adventure. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are really blue, and the dreams you dare to dream really do come true. And in the end of her adventure, Glinda the Good Witch tells her that she never really had to do anything to go home. She always had that ability herself. She just needed to believe there's no place like home. And once she gets home, she realizes that she didn't need to be dreaming of some better land. She has everything that she needed right here on her farm in Kansas, even though the real reason she left is because the adults were going to take her dog away. Then in 1995, we get a new interpretation of Oz, a book published by Gregory Maguire called Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. 95 years after the original and 56 years after the movie, we get a new vision of the story that combines elements from both, but from a much darker perspective. The author revisits the familiar world of Oz, but this time brings with it the new concerns, fears, questions of his day. The lines between good and evil are not easily drawn. The reasons for why someone might end up being good or evil are examined in sometimes gruesome detail. There's a very clear fear about political propaganda and the way stories can be weaponized against people. Now, the adaptation of that book, the stage musical, keeps a lot of these elements, but it's got a pretty stark difference in tone. It abandons more of the gritty elements of the book. A lot of those elements from the book are sort of meant to reflect what the author saw as the overarching problems of society, and I think the play abandons those mostly in favor of focusing on the character drama. The creators of the musical even said that at one point they felt like they were creating more of an original work than a direct adaptation of Maguire's book, because they felt they were more taking one of Maguire's major ideas where they retell the story from the point of view of somebody that has been made out to be Wicked. And it's one of the highest grossing musicals of all time, so obviously this idea resonated with people, retelling a famous story from the point of view of somebody that has been villainized. And finally, we come back to Wicked Part 1, which I think is a pretty loyal adaptation of the musical, but even just this first half of the story is longer than the entire stage play. So obviously they're taking some liberties, expanding the story. It's definitely a new iteration of the narrative. So I think Oz has served for over a century now as America's first and most enduring fairy tale, because it's the place that we've collectively agreed to return to time and again for a couple different reasons. One is to escape. Escapism cannot be denied. It was essentially the first reason the author gave for writing the story originally, and no matter how gritty the take, each of these stories has taken place in a fantasy world, a place of magic and wonder. But the reason it resonates deeper is because Oz has always reflected the culture that Americans are experiencing. And when that reflection starts to fade, Oz allows storytellers to come in, clean that mirror, and reflect something new about that culture. All that said, Wicked and The Wizard of Oz have both seen massive success on the world stage, so by no means am I saying it's a story exclusively for US audiences, obviously. But I do think the lasting relationship between this world and American culture is pretty fascinating, so I would love to hear your thoughts about it.